This is the Resonant Identity, and I'm Terrence Waters. If this framework resonates with you, please share the show with someone who's exploring identity, alignment, or transformation, and follow the podcast on your favorite platform and leave a review to help others find it. All links, including our YouTube channel, can be found in the show notes and are also found at our website at theresonantidentity.com. An additional note to disclosure about the podcast can be found in the show's description notes. Which, by the way, you're welcome. I kind of felt it was a good thing to bring out the disclosures and put them in a better spot. So now we can actually get started much quicker. And I really appreciate you listening to the episode at this point and also the podcast, just because we've really gotten to 10 episodes, 12 episodes all the way through. And it feels really good to being able to say that we've been able to get to this point. And I really do hope that you've learned a lot and been able to apply a lot of these things to your life. So thanks for sticking with me as we continue on this journey to helping us with identity transformation and knowing what we stand for and helping us stand up for it. So this episode, what we're going to now be talking about is understanding how to apply the actual drive system while also being able to score ourselves and ensuring that when we do enact our drives, that we're doing so in a meaningful manner, while also ensuring that we stay true to what it is that we actually can do. And so in order for us to be able to do that, we need to now talk about the stand by which the drives actually come from, by understanding what guardrails are, how we actually journal our understanding of what our drives are, and then being able to score ourselves using the DII model of the Resonance Core Framework. And we're going to be using these three tools to form a very specific single system, which is what we call the Resonant Identity Thesis, which ensures that guardrails that we set up prevent the drift that we have in our drive system, that we check into our journaling to see if we can see different patterns of how we might be able to establish or create new drives, and then how DII scoring quantifies that alignment so that we can start to see improvements in progression over time. Now, we use these as the intersection of identity, integrity, and transformation, because we can simply say, like we always mentioned before, that we are aligned, that the decisions that we are making actually do ring true with us, but we also need to be able to score ourselves and evaluate and reflect to make sure that we still are aligned. Because as we see every single day, our identity transforms, who we are changes, what we stand for evolves, and we need a scoring system and a data-driven decision analysis to being able to understand if we are making those decisions well and are transforming. Because over time, that should be the expected result, right? Because that's what we're trying to do, is work toward our identity evolution and transformation. And in order to do this, we need to be able to govern ourselves, understand clarity about ourselves, instead of simply relying on our willpower or our motivation or our own personal biases, which do tell us on our own, especially our ego, that we are aligned. Because we need to really be able to show ourselves and the world that we are transforming. And then that way we can take that data and actually improve what we're learning about ourselves so that we can make those adjustments as we go along. And our daily journaling rituals and our scoring make that possible. Now, the information that was gathered for this podcast has found from various topics in relating to stoicism, involving journalism as a practice, principalism, Aristotle's rhetoric in terms of the three triad, the logos, pathos, and ethos, virtue ethics, deontology. You'll also find this information in my forthcoming book later this year, The Resonance Core Framework, in chapters 5, 7, and 26, which reference journaling, guardrails, and also the DII scoring system. You can find information about all these topics and more in our references section of the show notes. So first, what we want to talk about is understanding what guardrails are, which are basically the adherence and understanding of our own self-governance. Because as much as we would love to be able to say that we can do so many things, making changes, looking into creating an unlimited amount of drives and MVDs, unfortunately, the truth that we do have to face is that we are limited by what we actually can accomplish and do. And these come from not just ourselves, but also the systems that we are a part of as part of our daily lives. Because guardrails are not necessarily limitations, but they are personal barriers because it helps us understanding resonance and it helps us understanding distortion while also giving us an understanding of what is feasible, making sure that we make drives that are things that we can actually do day to day, ensuring that we also have those specific limitations to ensuring that we make decisions in line not just with what society and the world expects of us, but also in line with what we actually value, what we specifically understand. And despite what we might think in terms of how we see guardrails themselves, they actually are not meant to be limiting factors. They actually do give us the ability of understanding what is possible rather than actually limiting us to explaining what is not. Because many times when we see that we have the world at our shoulders, the sky's the limit, we have the ability of making so many different types of decisions. In essence, it actually overwhelms the mind. And what then happens is we tend to go down the pathways of rationalization, avoidance, and ego protection. Because when we then don't have guardrails, we have the ability of making so many different types of choices that it overwhelms the system. And it actually leads us down that pathway to where we then just don't do anything because we just don't see the value in making choices when we really have the opportunity of doing whatever we want. Because what guardrails do is it actually takes us and shows us what is possible and limits down to let us know specifically what is not. And what this ends up doing is give us a strong sense of coherence with convenience and understanding ourselves with alignment by ensuring that we do our best to not avoid situations or choices that empower us to being able to change into who we want to become through identity transformation. And this comes from ideas in terms of personal mastery, which actually is borrowed from philosophy, not just from Aristotle, like virtue ethics, like we've been talking before. It also comes from a state of stoicism. I give you a nod, by the way, Ryan Holiday. I rather enjoy your stuff. But honestly, this gives us an understanding of personal mastery, self-governance, recognizing that we can have the empowerment ourselves to make decisions without anybody else's permission. That is a little bit empowering and, of course, has a lot of responsibility attached to it because with great power comes great responsibility, as they say. And in Stoicism, this actually is known as the self-governance principle, which allows us to being able to say that we want to set guardrails, both internally and those that are externally given to us, to show us what's possible. And from there, we can then make personal ethical decisions that are aligned with our value virtue system and our drives that we have established. And because it shows us the limitations of our decisions, it also helps us with rationalization. Because the less and less that we can make choices for ourselves, the more opportunity that it actually gives us to ensuring that we do make decisions, because they're much more easier to piece together. Because our minds are then able to understand what is possible, so it doesn't overwhelm us. And then the ego is able to then go ahead and continue on and quiets down. Because then we see that in order for us to be able to make those decisions, we need to define what they are. And that's what guardrails afford us. Now, I do need to make one distinction before we continue. Because guardrails are actually involving our value system, our morality, our ethics, and external forces that tell us what we can and cannot do. And these are not to be confused with personal boundaries. Because boundaries are things that we set within our guardrails to ensure that we conserve the limited energy resources that we have in any given day. This is something that we will talk about much later as we start to talk about resilience. But just for now, boundaries are what we talk about when we want to ensure that we are preserving our own ability for what we can and cannot do in any given period. Guardrails, on the other hand, are set in a much more broad sense. They are given to us to being able to help us understand who we are, what we stand for and why, while also being able to afford us the limitations of what is possible. So when we talk about guardrails, please understand that these are much more broad in terms of how we define them. And when we get into boundaries later, these are personal boundaries that we define within our guardrails, not the other way around. So this is the first step in helping us, tell us what's possible. And then later we'll be able to withstand it by showing us what is possible in any given moment. So it'd make a little bit more sense because they do sound a lot the same, but just know for now as we start to define them, there is a difference between personal boundaries and these guardrails that we are establishing as part of the Resonance Core framework. So in my book in chapter 7, when I talk about guardrails, I basically mention that there are 4 very distinct type of guardrail categories, and we're going to go into each of them in depth so that way you can understand what they mean. Now, first, what I want to explain is understanding what are called ethical guardrails. Now, we have already established a little bit of them through our value virtue system, which is establishing that code of conduct and how we actually can decide to conduct ourselves, both internally and with our own lives and outside of our lives. But it also adds a little bit more to it because these guardrails, once adhered to, also give us our personal moral code, explaining to us really what it is that we want to decide to do and how to conduct ourselves as we start to make decisions internally and externally with our world. This takes on personal responsibility, understanding that we, as stewards of the Resonance Core framework, aim to go for identity transformation while also ensuring that we do not cause harm or malice in the work that we do. Because we could definitely make decisions that specifically get ourselves ahead, that could push others down, and will, yes, sometimes involve identity transformation. But if those guardrails are not personally established, that actually limits our ability to establish our own personal moral code. Because those morals, which are the things of being able to say what we believe in and what we need to avoid, are the important things in understanding specifically how to conduct ourselves in the world. Ethics are specific from person to person, and it is something that is defined individually that cannot be established by any person or external source. These are things that must be understood by you. What it is you value, what it is that makes you virtuous, what are the things that specifically you want to embody when you make decisions. And we're not talking about legal situations here. We're talking about those gray areas of nuance. When you're asked to be put to the test on some of those decisions where you have to ask yourself, what is the right decision here? Because gray areas are not illegal. There's different ways that you can approach every single situation and different ways that you can make a decision. And so it's important that you understand specifically what your personal ethical and moral code are. Those two specific things must be established by you outside of the value virtue system. You're listening to The Resonant Identity with Terrence Waters. We'll be right back. This is The Resonant Identity with Terrence Waters. Welcome back. Now, we talked about earlier how we do base the value virtue system off of virtue ethics program, which explains that for us to being able to be virtuous, we need to always make decisions in line with our value virtue system. This is a standard point of the Resonance Core framework, which is how we establish drives, as we explained in the prior episode. But this also does not necessarily mean that you need to adopt virtue ethics as part of your ethical code, because there are other ways of being able to understand how to make decisions that have been established throughout the ethical systems. These are systems that have been brought out that help us be able to make decisions when we are stuck in that gray area. Virtue ethics we've already discussed, so let me talk about the other two specifically. The first one that we can go over is what is called utilitarianism. Now, this is a framework that allows us to being able to say, when we want to make decisions, we want to understand that what the action is, what the intention of it is, and what the end results or consequences will be, that as much as we can potentially foretell them. And when we talk about these three different ethics systems, we always focus on either one of the three options that you see here. So again, the action itself, the repercussions of that action or the consequences, or the intent. And it always leads down the pathway of action to intent down to consequences. Because all three of those, with every single decision that we have, always results in those three prerequisites for a decision to be made. So when we talk about these three ethical processes, please be aware of that model. And you will see this again on our website on the companion article on the resonantidentity.com. So utilitarianism looks at the consequences side of our actions. It does not consider itself in terms of its action itself or in terms of the actual intention. What utilitarianism argues is that when you want to make a decision, you need to evaluate the impact of the actual decision by ensuring that you create the largest amount of good for the biggest amount of group of people. Basically, it does not take into account what the action might be, and it also does not take into account your intention. Now, keep in mind, this does not necessarily mean that we want to have you go against laws and regulations and so forth, which is another category we'll get into in a minute. But what you need to understand here is that utilitarianism looks at the action and says, how can I make an action that will benefit the most amount of people to ensure their happiness or their greater good? That's what utilitarianism is if you adopt that as part of ethics. It allows you to make decisions that may seem a little on edge depending on who sees it, But if you make decisions with that actual consequence in mind, it allows you to being able to say that you are making an ethical decision for yourself because you have established those guardrails in saying that you have adopted utilitarianism as your ethics system. The next ethical code system that you could adopt is called deontology, or what is known as Kant's law. Essentially, what this is a moral philosophy that looks at the morality of the decision that you are making in terms of quote unquote right or wrong. This is based on your moral code, which is understanding what you see as a right action or a wrong action, a truthful action or a distorted action. And based on that, as long as you are making decisions from your own moral ethical code, you are able to say that you are ethically aligned. You are making decisions that are defined by your moral code in your guardrails, so that when you make decisions from that moral code, you can also say that you are ethically aligned. And then finally, like we mentioned before, there's the virtue ethics, which basically says as long as you're living a principle-centered life around your actual virtues, you can say that you are living a virtuous life. And all three of these options, utilitarianism, Kant's law, or virtue ethics, can be borrowed from and utilized as part of your guardrails to help you establish a strong ethical code of conduct. That is basically how that works. And from there, you can allow yourself to establish your moral system and the understanding of what you believe is correct decisions or wrong decisions based on your own personal life. But this also gives you the empowerment to saying that I don't want to adopt any type of system at all. I simply understand that the right thing for me to do is X. And that allows me to being able to say that I am ethically aligned so long as you are making decisions within your guardrail system. Our ultimate goal as stewards of the Resonance Core framework is to ensure that we make decisions that forego the ability for us to being able to cause harm as much as possible to other people. That ensures that when we make those decisions, even if they happen to not necessarily look at the action itself, it's still rooted in our ethical system because we choose, as part of our guardrails, to establish them. Next, what I'd like to talk about is what are called principle guardrails, the second category. These are what are known as chosen identity commitments, or our virtue system. And the good part is we've already established a lot of this already. Our value virtue system is, in and of itself, a principle guardrail, because those happen to show us specifically what is aligned with our identity and what is aligned with the commitments that we want to make when we make decisions. So our guardrails not only do give us the information about what is possible, they also align with what it is we want to accomplish as part of our identity transformation stakes. And the more that we refine our value virtue system, the better we become at it, because we then start to understand more and more how we're able to make decisions that actually do embody our guardrails as well. Because the more that you define your value virtue system and hone it in, you're able to then see again what is possible because you are able to set those guardrails that are in line with the drives that you're committing to. And you can use, as we mentioned last episode, the drive loop and the drive alignment loop to understanding from a data-driven decision-making lens if those are aligned, and changing those boundaries as necessary if you find during running those loops that something just didn't work quite right. That's what this allows you to do, is ensuring that those guardrail systems are in place. Now, before we get into external guardrails, I want to also talk about what are known as optional guardrails. So from the Resonance Core framework, before we go forward, it's very important that you understand that all of the tools that we have as part of this work you are doing are optional, right? There are some basic things like your value virtue system, your DII scoring, the information about defining your identity, window of choice, regulation, and things like that that must be adhered to in order for this framework to work. But there are parts of this, because of modular precision, that you're allowed to borrow from and change up a little bit as you start to understand more about what works for you and what doesn't. This is one of those areas that you're able to look at your guardrails and see if you want to add some things that actually more embody who you are, but they're not required for you to do so. And that's the beauty of what we do here, is that your life is your own and you're able to make it whatever you'd like it to be. So when we talk about optional guardrails, these are things that are specifically around developmental situations, things that embody a little bit more of your identity that your value virtue system doesn't quite cover. that ethical and moral codes don't seem to overlap with. That there are things that you strongly adhere to and resonate with that aren't really specifically given in the framework, but still resonate with you. This involves things like situational circumstances. This could be religious stances. This could be political stances. It can also be roles that you assume in terms of your actual identity. It could also be workplace requirements or limitations, things like that, that do happen to embody more about who you are because you choose them, but also are not required to be there. And I mention this because these are things you choose to adopt with because they resonate with you. So as you're evaluating your guardrail system, when you start to understand different things that you might want to adopt, we approach it the exact same way as we have everything else. Because guardrails themselves also are data points. And we run the resonance test with integrative hygiene and the triad system to try them out, to see if those optional identities or guardrails make sense to us, if we want to align with them or not. And if they do resonate from the cues all the way up into our narratives and external, then yes, we should embody them. But it also is not required, because if we find that you do not resonate with some areas that you are being given, you should not adopt those as part of your identity alignment and your transformation. Now, the final thing I want to talk about specifically are what are called external guardrails. These are externalities, things that unfortunately none of us can control in terms of what is possible, what we are allowed to do, or what we are not allowed to do. But I do want to go over some very specific categories because there are some areas where you will experience some nuance. Some of those are very, very strict in black and white. But what you will see also is even the black and white ones don't necessarily mean that they will be 100% black or 100% white. And you'll see what I mean here in a second. So the first ones that are obvious are, of course, the laws and regulations that we deal with in both the workplace, our businesses, our homes, our country, societal experiences, governmental regulations, things like that. These are things that are set by the societies in which we live, and those things cannot be controlled. These are things set by other systems external to us that limit the ability of us for what we can do or what we cannot do. Now, of course, this does not mean that you cannot do certain things, but most of the time, if you happen to cross those guardrails of external laws, they result in consequences, both civil and criminal, depending on what it is you're doing. Some people do happen to go outside of those guardrails, which is why I say that it isn't 100% black or 100% white. I'm not encouraging it by any means, shape, or form, but I am giving you the information to tell you it is possible to say that you want to remove them or decide not to abide by them. Just know that if you do choose that or embody it as part of your identity, you're also accepting the consequences of doing so. If you decide not to exercise your right to free speech in the United States, as an example, you have that right to not do that. But will there be externality or consequences if you choose not to do that? Probably not. But if we talk about other things, which are specific more around laws like criminal laws, shoplifting, burglary, assault, things like that, of course there will be consequences if you get caught. Of course, there's those 4 words, if you get caught, which again, I'm not advocating for you to please do not, consider doing anything law breaking. We'd appreciate that. But to let you know, that's what happens or could happen to you in terms of consequence if you do happen to cross that guardrail. You could be thrown in jail. You could be assessed levies, fines, community service. Who knows? And it's important for you to understand those limitations because every action comes with a consequence, as we mentioned in our ethical and moral guardrail systems. The next ones are a little bit more nuanced. They kind of give us a little bit of leeway in saying that, yes, can you go ahead and cross these guardrails? Sure. But it may result in some consequences that you may not expect. Some things that could potentially cause worse situations for you depending on the severity or how you cross that guardrail. The first one we want to talk about are what are called societal norms. So these are basically the way in which we live our life. How society says you need to put your head down and not speak up when you are in class. You need to ensure that you are in respect when you are at a funeral. You are expected to stay in line, go to work from 9 to 5 if you take this job, and so on. These are all norms, which some are defined by external sources like workplace scenarios. Some are explained in terms of societal expectations and so on. And there's no law breaking circumstance if you do happen to cross a guardrail in one of these cases. So if you decide to be loud and rowdy at a funeral, you're definitely going to get a lot of ridicule from a lot of people, but there's nothing illegal about what it is you're actually doing. You're just making yourself look like a jerk, essentially. But if you look at it this way, that kind of shows you the boundaries of where things start to then begin to show gray areas. Because nuance, which involves the differences between black and white thinking and the truth of what is happening in a scenario, as we know about from truth and reality, this is more telling you what actually is possible. And so sometimes breaking cultural norms or societal norms can actually give a positive experience, depending on the case. Don't believe me? Well, let's think about it this way. In the civil rights movement, where we were dealing with so many issues of people experiencing racism, segregation of circumstances, having to sit in different areas of the bus, using different restroom facilities, and so on, simply because of people's color of their skin. It was because people decided to sit against the norm of being able to say, no, this is something that I do not believe in, and here's why. That is actually a societal norm that someone, as they were defending and wanting to stand up for civil human rights, chose to break that norm by crossing that guardrail. Rosa Parks comes to mind with her ability of sitting where she wanted to on the bus, which at the time was against the law, but she saw it in terms of understanding what she believed in her identity. And that is what is called civil disobedience, which is basically saying that you have the ability and the choice to saying you want to make a choice that may or may not be 100% legal or even with societal norms, but stands up in terms of your identity because of its alignment for something that you stand up for and believe in. Had people not done that process, it is very possible that segregation and issues that we do not think about at all in today's world could have still been the norm because people decided to rebel. People decided to make changes outside of societal norms. But there's also another type, which is actually a type of collapse, which is called defiance, which is where a person goes in and decides that they just simply want to stand up against authority. They do not believe in the ability of a society having a governmental system or a law-abiding process. These are the people that simply stand up to authority because they want to. That is identity collapse. Because instead of actually working toward a common goal that is actually aligned in terms of your belief system, you're simply doing defiant acts, which civil disobedience technically is a defiant act, but you're doing it from a place of distortion. You're doing it from a place simply of lack of understanding, and I would also argue maturity. But that, I digress. Who knows what the case may be. But the difference in civil disobedience and defiance are one of them is in asking for change because of seeing injustice in ways that are affecting people. Defiance is simply making choices that are in defiance of actual laws and regulations for no reason. The difference between the two is in understanding identity alignment. And so if you happen to align with a political stance that says you want to actually stand up against injustice, discrimination, or whatever, you're allowed to do that through protesting, through being civilly disobedient in marching, by deciding to do something that actually might be illegal. It is possible. But it's very important that you exercise your understanding of consequences that come with those decisions as well. Because if you happen to be in a workplace where you're making six figures and you are a manager over people, but you still decide to make civil disobedient decisions, that actually has the ability of affecting your ability of what it is you're doing in the workplace, because you are expected to live under a certain level of expectation and professionalism that someone on the outside may see that behavior as misaligned with your actual title. This is just one example, but this gives you an idea of how societal norms, as no matter how well intentioned you may be in your decision making, can cross over other guardrails that may cause problems. And so it's very important that you be mindful of what your guardrails are and also the external ones that you happen to face as you're making decisions. Now, before we go to break, I'm just going to go over one more final step, which is understanding the limitations of what it is you can do based on your current place of where you live. And this comes down to cultural norms, socioeconomic, I love that word, socioeconomic limitations, religious issues, third world or loss of income processes, poverty, sometimes even your race, sometimes even other issues as well. This is not to say that just because you are a member of one of these groups that you are limited. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is there are very specific limitations that do occur in some countries that do limit what people can and cannot do simply because of the situations that you are in. I cannot go over specifically what those are. It also is not my place to say what those may be or may not be. Because, again, the resonance core framework aims to be a neutral stance. It is simply here to say that there are people who experience limitations in what they can and cannot do simply because of where they live, or the family that they are brought up in, or things like that. That's just life, and it does happen from time to time. Some people may be more affluent than others and have the ability of being able to use more resources than the person down the street. Another person may not actually have as much knowledge as other people and therefore may be limited in what they can and cannot do. Disabilities or motor skills or issues in relating to their capacity to making decisions can also creep up in this way. Heaven forbid that, of course, happen, but unfortunately, it is a reality we face in this world. If only we had a magic wand, right? But that's just what I'm trying to get at, is to understanding that when you set your guardrails, you also need to set realistic expectations about what is not possible, especially when it comes to your sphere of influence, understanding what you can and cannot control, and the limitations that are put on by you from external sources that you cannot control. Because unfortunately, those things do come up. And if you happen to make your value virtue drive system in a relation area that is actually inability to actually be reached, you're then not going to be able to transform because you're making decisions not at all, really. You're not making decisions in that case because you're not able to meet them because those external forces are also limiting your ability. So to close this part up just real quick before we go to break, guardrails are the ways of which we look into our personal situation, understanding our moral and ethical codes, understanding what we stand for, understanding those things that are put on us by external forces, and aligning with those things through optional guardrails that embolden us, that actually stand for who we are, that add more value to our life because we choose to resonate with them. And if we find guardrails or things that do not align with us through modular precision, again, we're allowed to remove them. You're listening to The Resonant Identity with Terrence Waters. We'll be right back. This is The Resonant Identity with Terrence Waters. Welcome back. So there was a leader, Marcus Aurelius, back in the BCE eras, who was an incredible journalist. He was a person who embodied stoicism, and he embodied it by literally self-evaluating himself at night every single day. Every day. He was very popular with the people he led. He was very astute. He led many different battles to war and was very, very good as a leader, a very wonderful leader. But the way he was able to do that was through his journaling practices. Because here's the thing, we forget stuff. We forget what we have done the day before, even a couple of hours before when people ask us what we did for the day. And the problem is because of how our brain works, it is fabricated in distortion. It is always recollecting information and memories in ways that actually do not make sense. But to it fills in the pieces. So when we try to recall a thought, an event of something that happened, psychology tells us simply that we tend to take it and exaggerate it. We can recall some pieces of what happened in our memory, but then there are those little holes that happen, things that don't quite make sense in terms of the story that we're telling ourselves. And our biases, especially our ego, loves to overflate it and loves to fill in those gaps with things that really had nothing to do with the event in the first place. This is what happens when we try to recall things because unfortunately our brain has only a limited capacity in what is able to hold. Journaling solves that problem. Because here's the thing. If we're having trouble remembering things from a day ago, a week ago, a month ago, how would we actually know every single day that we are aligned in the decisions that we are making? Yeah, we'll experience resonance in the feelings, and we usually dwell on those mistakes that we make because that's what our brain does. It loves to be the person to tell us that we're a failure, right? We know this, and we are doing our best to try to work through those narratives. But journaling is one of the best ways that we can actually get data, getting information directly to our minds through reading to show us that we are aligned over time. Because in the moment, yes, we will know whether we made decisions that are aligned or not pretty well, at least to being able to say how the resonance comes through. But if we need to reflect back on things, especially if we need to make sure that those drives still are viable, we need to then understand specifically how can we track that? How can we track a historical value? And this is what journaling does. It allows us to being able to take what our ego wants to say about the situation, removes it entirely, and requires us to write about it. Because when you try to tell somebody information about directions, how to get someone from one place to another, you have to literally take words and describe something in very easy to understand terms. No distortion, no bias, no ego. You are literally using words to describe what is happening, how to get the person from point A to point B. And journaling does the exact same thing for us. So we may not be able to 100% recall everything that happened over the day, but what happens is our brain needs to find a way to being able to make sense of it in a way that allows us to write it down so that when we read it later or show someone else about the actual article, they'll be able to understand it. And the best part is when we write, journaling takes out all of that bias. It actually makes it so that we write down straight line information. So when we say that we were experiencing sadness or that I am unlovable or talking about all of these things, and we write those things down, we're actually able to see specifically some of the narratives and some of the distortion that comes from our decision-making process. It also shows us some clues in helping us understand, well, wait a minute, why was that misaligned? What cues did I experience in that moment and why? Why might I be experiencing these cues and what can I do about them? Because what it does is it gives us the ability to process what is going on from a step one, step two, step three understanding of an event. That person started by saying this. And what happened with me was I started experiencing this in my cues. And then I started thinking these thoughts. And I think this might be why I thought those thoughts. And when I said what I said, this person did this, this, and this. Those are very straight line specific wordings in describing an actual event. There's no bias in it. You're literally just describing from your best recollection what happened. And from there, that then brings in a straight line view of reporting that doesn't have slant. Now, you may still experience those areas where you start, talking about your voice and you start talking about what happens in your narratives and all the emotions that you're experiencing. And this person said this and this made me feel this way or whatever else may be. That's valid. And yes, journaling can be done to help with that sometimes, especially if it's a way to help you with regulation. But the truth is that information also can be used as data. Because when you start to then write down those things of your cues and your emotions starting to cycle, that then does what's called patterning, which is tracking repeated cues that occur over time from stimuli or situations you've encountered that trigger those cues. So you may experience it that one time and wonder, where are these things coming from? I'm getting these cues, but I don't know why I'm so upset. But then what happens is as you start daily journaling some of those experiences, you'll then start to look back at the entries that you've given and you'll be able to see those patterns of what it is actually triggering them. And it usually comes from our distortion and the vast unknown of our mind, which shows that hidden truth. So when you get triggered by it, you're then able to explore a little bit more through, again, a data-driven decision-making lens. Asking yourself, where did this come from? What was the situation that occurred? And you can run the resonance test and understand where it may have come from. You'll be able to evaluate it because the data is in your journal. And you can do it with multiple entries, because as you start seeing the same cues happen over and over and over again over several days, you'll then start to notice a pattern, which then can be used in your data-driven decision-making processes. From there, you're then able to uncover the hidden truth of what your vast unknown is telling you. And from there, you're then able to say, I think I'm believing this, but I now see this as being rooted in this. And this is the hidden truth that I need to make sure that I remind myself of. And the best benefit of doing daily journaling is then once you start to see those patterns, when you experience them over and over again, you'll start to recognize them more. Because not only are you experiencing them in the moment, you've been able to ascertain why they happen. Because your journaling actually tells you why. Journaling is meant to be raw data. It's not meant to be slanted. It's not giving you a critique or a recollection of how bad you were the past day. It's meant to be for you. It's meant for you to piece together some puzzle pieces to understanding who you are, understanding the distortions that are in your life, so you can then work through them and realign them in who you are and who you want to become. And it also can be used as a gauge to help you understand your guardrail system and your value virtue drive system with what you stand for and why. Because as you make decisions, you're then going to also be writing down how you felt as you enacted your drives. You're going to start to see that there's some holes in what happens with your guardrail system. That maybe you've established some guardrails, but now what's happening is you're too strict on not making decisions that actually would benefit you. Or maybe you're also able to drop some guardrails or realign them in something that makes more sense to you. It's only through drives, through those inactions that are written in journaling, that you'll be able to see that and being able to piece together what you need to do next. Because what journaling does is it interrupts those cognitive loops, those ego rationalization issues, the ways that we try to rationalize and get ourselves out of making decisions, and instead tells us why we decided not to make that decision. Because if you're truly doing the right journaling processes, you're actually writing down what went through your mind, your narratives and your cues, the chest tightening and the things you were experiencing when you were in that situation, what you ultimately decided to do, and then comparing it with your value virtue drive system and your guardrails. So you can look at it and say, was this actually the right decision? And if it wasn't, you can then start to ascertain why. Because if you write down that information correctly in your journal itself will tell you over time, especially as you start to see the patterns, step 1, step 2, step 3, over several days in very similar situations. You're listening to The Resonant Identity with Terrence Waters. We'll be right back. This is The Resonant Identity with Terrence Waters. Welcome back. So you may be asking yourself, what are you supposed to do when you journal? The answer is it's meant to be simply an integrity check-in, and it can be anything that you want. But what I usually like to do in my processes is understanding the day's events, looking at my drive system, my guardrails, and looking specifically at the events that kind of correlate to some of those. I don't need to write down every single thing that happened over the entire day. We're looking for those specific situations where we were asked to identify and stand up for our identity. We're looking for those situations that expand or contract our window of choice. We look at those situations with what are called thresholds that ask us to activate our identity. We'll go over thresholds in the next episode, but for now, just know that when you experience those moments where your identity is on the line and you're asked to make a decision, that threshold is a very strong aspect and indicator of how well aligned you are under pressure. And so when you experience those moments also, you're going to want to document them down. Regardless of whatever decision you make, we're not here to critique ourselves. We're simply using it as data to help us make more decisions. And I caution you when you do this as well, because it's very common for us to want to simply critique ourselves as we start writing down all these things. We can say, yes, I experienced sadness and frustration, and I didn't make the decision, and I feel terrible, and I wish I would have done this, and I wish I would have done that. And the thing is, the more that you go down that pathway, you're starting to distort a little bit more about the actual situation. because you're then giving into your cues and your narratives that may not be reminiscent of the issue. Sure, you'll experience them, and yes, you should write those down if you experience those cues and narratives. But as you're journaling, do your best that you can not to incorporate more than what the actual event occurred. In other words, if you happen to be experiencing frustration or cues as you're journaling, it's going to come out in your writing. So it's very important that you do what's called purposeful journaling, ensuring that you are grounded, that you are neutral, that your cues are not flaring up, your thoughts are not swirling over what happened the prior day. You want to be in a place where you can just simply record what happened. That's it. We don't need to critique ourselves any more than we already do, right? We don't need to relive all of those situations over and over and over again in our minds and in our feelings. We instead just simply need to recall. That's it. Because over time, as long as we stay as close as we can neutral and grounded in the way that we write, over time, it starts to show those patterns, like I mentioned before, which we can then use those as data-driven decision-making points to being able to evaluate them to see, do I need to define some more guardrails? Do I need to change the guardrails that are in my system? Do I need to update my drives? Are my values different? Am I noticing something different about my identity that I didn't know before? Because that's what journaling allows us to do. Daily journaling, which just like Marcus Aurelius did, gives us the ability to reevaluate all the decisions that we're making and ensure that we're living an identity coherent life. Because over time, it then shows us what it is we need to do to improve, so that way we can make decisions more aligned with who we want to become by making those small adjustments, those small changes to our MBD, dropping drives altogether, even value virtues if they happen to not align, maybe changing our ethical code a little bit, maybe adopting some political views that we weren't actually even aware of that we actually enjoy. Whatever the case may be, journaling gives us the ability to actually give us that window into ourselves, because our minds have to record things in a way that we have to understand through words. And that's where the ego shuts off. Because as you're recording, you literally have to explain specifically what happened. And that removes the spin and the bias, so that when you reevaluate these later, as you start understanding more about yourself, you're then able to recall and see patterns so that you know what to do to enact, what to change and update, or even drop as part of your identity coherence, your transformation, and your value, virtue, drive, and guardrail system. You're listening to the Resonant Identity with your host, Terrence Waters. We'll be right back. This is the Resonant Identity with Terrence Waters. Welcome back. Now that we've talked about guardrails and journaling practices that we go through every day, we now need to talk about the third process, which is really the engine of the Resonance Core framework. And this is called the DII, the Decision Integrity Index. Because just as we want to use journaling as raw data, we also need to be able to evaluate how it is we're doing in terms of our decisions. And these are simple scores. These are means by which we can look at the decisions from what we've made and actually look back and see how well we are aligned in that moment. Now, also, this isn't just simply a score, because the DII, the Decision Integrity Index, is a marking of helping you understand your true alignment with your chosen identity, and also your value virtue system that happens to be rooted in your guardrails and also in your values and your drives. Because as you're making decisions, once we document those in our journal, we also want to evaluate them. And we want to understand that specific understanding of clarity, to say, when we made that decision, did it actually really align with our identity, with what we stand for and why? Because journaling, of course, does give that information just simply written down on paper, but we also need to evaluate it. Because as we mentioned before, we only have so much that we remember about our decisions and our alignment. There is not a way for us to being able to measure transformation unless we see a progression over time. Data-driven decision-making is not just simply evaluating data points in relation to our identity. It's also identifying ourselves, how well we are aligned, and scoring ourselves to helping us understand that process in line with our resonance, our thresholds, and our identity. Now, there's a specific formula that goes over this, which we'll get into much later in this process. But what I need you to understand now is that we use the DII in a simple scoring system to help us understand alignment in its actuality, not just how you feel, because it provides us what's called quantitative clarity. For those of you who don't know statistics, we're now about to give you a little math and statistics lesson. So hold your britches. It's not too hard, but I just want you to see what this means. So when someone asks you, how was your day yesterday? And someone responds to you and you say, good. What does that mean? What does good mean? What does great mean? What does wonderful mean? What does bad mean? What does okay mean? When you hear those words, they're ambiguous. They're distorted, just like values. Good means something different to each and every single person. Good could be great. I feel wonderful. I'm in really high spirits. All of these different things. To another person, good could just mean, yeah, average, whatever. Things are all right, you know. That is specific to each and every single person because definitions, which these are called qualitative means of data, they are specific to the individual. They don't mean anything else to anyone else. And also, they are not universal from person to person. So when a person says that they're great, their definition of great and what they think the day is much different than what someone else thinks the world of in terms of greatness. And so when we look at it that way, qualitative analysis, which is how we look at our decisions and try to evaluate how well we made them and how well they were aligned, if we use terms like good, great, excellent, okay, what it means when you record that day could potentially even change 3 weeks from now. So when you say that you were good in a decision, but you also say you were good in a decision 3 weeks later, are they the same marking? No, because what was good to you then may not mean the same thing of good for you now. This is why qualitative data is usually never used in individualistic situations because it is skewed in distortion and it has the ability of being skewed in terms of trying to truly understand a raw data source, especially when you're wanting to understand things like agreeance or disagreeance. So when you see those surveys where people are asking strongly agree, strongly disagree, or so on, what they're doing in that case actually is not qualitative data. You are seeing the words strongly agree, strongly disagree, and so on, which means different things to you. But here's what's happening actually with those people who are conducting those surveys. They're actually taking your answers and assigning them a numerical ordinal value, numbered 1 through 4. So if you have the values of strongly agree, agree, strongly disagree, and disagree, those are numerical rankings on the back end. So basically, a person is taking that, the statistics guy that's running through all of the responses they receive from that survey, and they're assigning them a value. Strongly agree being 1 or 4, depending on what they want to do in terms of numerical statistics. And they're ranking them, which strongly agree is the very highest and strongly disagree is the very lowest. That is what is called quantifiable data. When I say quantifiable, think of it like the word quantity. We use this in terms of statistics, which gives us numerical data. Because if I say that on a scale of 1 to 5, my day was 3, you know what that means because a 3 is average. A 5 is excellent if it's on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being highest, 1 being lowest. You always establish that in terms of statistics. So in order for us to being able to measure things, it's much easier for us to be able to do so when it involves numbers, quantifiable ordinal data, because we can then look at that and establish trends. Because over time, those numbers then start to mean something to us because the number 4 is consistent. The number 2 is consistent. The number 5 is consistent, and so on. Because your definition of what good or great may be doesn't matter. It actually more means on what it is you are ranking yourself on in terms of numerical data. Over time, this is what establishes the DII of the resonance core framework, because you will start to score your decisions in line with your value system and your identity. And at that moment that you are making those scoring mechanisms in your journal, which is what this is going to do, whatever you scored that number means the same thing then than it does now, regardless of your decision of what great, good, excellent, or so on means. A 4 is still a 4. A 5 is still a 5. A 1 is still a 1, even 3 years from now. And so from there, that's why we call it an index, because it shows an average composite of period of time that shows us over time how well we are making aligned decisions or not, based on our own internal scoring. And we're not using this from anyone else. We're just simply doing this from an individualistic perspective. Now, this changes a little bit, of course, when we get into like team dynamics, group dynamics, and leadership, which the Resonance Core Framework can also do. But for the purposes of our alignment and our identity, this is just for us individually. This podcast is specifically for us as the individual. So just keep in mind when we go through these exercises that we're talking about just simply you scoring what it is you're working through. So exactly what does the DII do for us? What the DII does is it helps us measure the various different indicators of our own identity alignment, transformation, and virtue value system. The things that we measure are things like resonance, integrity, identity alignment, somatic coherence, guardrail adherence, identity cohesion, identity erosion, things like that. Even emotional intelligence in our grounding systems. How well we made our decisions under pressure, because sometimes that is required. How well we did in our thresholds. How well we adhered to our identity. Where we started to erode a little bit, and where we need to start working on different things. But the good news for our purposes, up until the point we get into the actual equations and so forth, we're actually going to do what's called the simple 1 through 5 journaling score, which is your current process of making sure that you're scoring the decisions that you make. And what you do here is you simply score yourself on a scale of 1 to 5. This will change over time because eventually it'll start to have more of a composite process with an equation. But for now, we want you to start looking into scoring your decisions based on this index, a scale of 1 through 5, which 1 means you've made a misaligned or a distorted decision. 2 means you've made some alignment but unclear. 3 means that you're neutral or mixed in how it actually aligns with yourself. 4 means that it's mostly aligned with yourself. And 5 means that you're fully aligned with your identities and drives. Now, of course, this is subjective. Numbering ourselves 1 through 5 is just doing the best that we can to look at our decisions and evaluate them to help us score on that 1 through 5 area. When you start to see more indicators a little bit later, you're going to see how we can expand this to make it more accurate. But the thing that we're actually wanting to process here and have you practice is instead being able to understand what resonance and alignment look like. Because when you're making decisions, you need to be the one to first understand if you are making aligned decisions and why, and what you did that helps you being able to justify the score that you gave yourself. We could score ourselves 5s all day long, which is very easy to do, right? We just simply say, yeah, I was aligned and this is with my drive and here's why, blah, 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 blah. But does that give you any help? No. It actually distorts the DII itself, because what you want to do in your scoring sessions is you want to evaluate every single part of the decision in terms of your identity alignment, your value virtues, your resonance, threshold understanding, and your guardrails, including the triad system through the data-driven decision-making lens, and your identity alignment lens, and your value virtue system lens, all 3. Because when you're doing these, you need to evaluate the entirety of your decision that you made. Did it resonate? Why did it not resonate? When you made the decision, how did you feel? Where did you notice that you were outside of your drive system? What did you uncover that may have actually shown you you're aligned in something else? That's where you're able to evaluate through interpretive hygiene and data-driven decision-making to looking into what it is that you're evaluating yourself on and asking yourself what makes sense. Because then you're able to fully align with what it is you believe in when you make that 5 score. Because not only are you simply scoring yourself, you're not doing so from a subjective reality or distortion or ego. You're actually doing it because the data told you that you are a 5. That's the goal. You want to be able to justify your score. You want to be able to write down specifically why you scored yourself what you did. Because when you go back and start looking at some of those drives that you've enacted multiple times, you're going to see those patterns emerge, especially if cues start showing up, misalignment starts coming through. You're noticing that you're faltering in some areas, because then you're able to establish further guardrails, enact further guardrails, refine guardrails, maybe change some of your MVDs, drop them altogether. Because the data from your journal is the thing that will help you make data-driven decisions correctly. It's the piece that will show you raw data that explains where your alignment is faltering, where your alignment is resonating, and where you need to make judgments and where you need to make changes as part of modular precision. And it's important that you do so from an embodied awareness lens when you're doing that journaling, because you want to truly evaluate yourself, not from a place of rejection, not from a place of putting yourself down or objection or anything or criticism. You actually want to do this just simply explaining what happened and how it worked, because journaling reveals the patterns. DII quantifies that alignment for you. And together, that gives you the feedback loop that you need in order to be able to refine your identity, ensuring that you are becoming who you want to become. And when you use these with guardrails, it ensures that you prevent yourself from going outside of your identity drift. It ensures that you keep aligned. It ensures that you're making decisions within those guardrails and not circumventing them in any way that will cause you issues or distortion. These three things, the journaling, the guardrails, and your DII, they make up the triad of decision integrity, because you're able to take all three of those items, understanding what is possible and what is not, understanding what actually happened in the moment, and evaluating yourself for what happened so that you can make decisions aligned, again, with your identity and what you stand for. You're listening to The Resonant Identity with your host, Terrence Waters. We'll be right back. This is The Resonant Identity. I'm Terrence Waters. Welcome back. Now we're going to talk about how to integrate the three together, which we've kind of alluded to a little bit before, but want to also cement it, especially as we start looking into the data-driven processes that we do to ensuring we make decisions from that data-driven area. And this is where we integrate these using what's called the decision triad. We've already talked about this in terms of interpretive hygiene and so on, but we want to drive it home because guardrails ends up being what we call the checks and balances, the quality assessment, the testing of everything. Because if we establish guardrails, but then don't actually evaluate them to make sure that they're correct, we're creating ourselves boundaries of something that actually doesn't exist, limiting our ability to make decisions. If we're not simply writing down what happened, why it happened, and how we felt, but instead slanting it in bias when we journal, this causes problems and distortion with the journal data that we have. And it may make it that we make decisions that are not aligned with who we are. And the DII needs to also be from a place of clarity as well. We need to evaluate our decisions by when we make our scores through data, through explaining why we're scoring ourselves the way that we do, what actually resonates with us in terms of that decision, and then how it aligns with us in terms of the self. These are the logos, pathos, ethos processes that we've been talking about throughout much of the Resonance Core framework, but now applied to guardrails, journaling, and the DII. And it comes just as simple as this. When we talk about guardrails, we first need to understand if it is an option that we want to embody, whether that's an external one or an internal one or one that we wish to adopt. We need to really truly outline it through an interpretive hygiene data loop in understanding, is this something I need? And we do that through three options, which is the logos, understanding the logical coherence of what it is we're adopting as a guardrail, understanding the pathos, how we feel about it, the intuition that kind of comes to us when we understand that guardrail, and the ethos, which helps us understand its identity alignment and our moral standing. Because not only are we talking about identity alignment, we also are now ensuring that we are adopting guardrails in line with our morals, our political stances, our ethics, our moral code of conduct, all of those things. Because those things that we choose to bring in are also part of our identity. And identity alignment ensures that we're also aligning with those parts of ourselves that we decide to adopt as guardrails. This is the new part of adding for our identity alignment with the self, the ethos, is that if we choose to make decisions or choose to embody guardrails that don't align with who we are, what we stand for, our ethics system, our political system, why are we doing that? Because we're making decisions and it's instilling guardrails that actually circumvent who we are. And now that we're starting to expand that knowledge and understanding things like utilitarianism, political stances, religious backgrounds, and so on, we need to make sure that our guardrails are aligned with all of those other guardrails we choose to adopt. And the same thing happens in terms of external ones. Though we cannot control the guardrails that are given and thrust upon us, those ones still need to be adhered to and established so that when we make other guardrails, we evaluate them against our externality circumstances. Because if we try to make guardrails specific that unfortunately we're just not able to make decisions because of socioeconomic pressures, cultural expectations or norms, or so on, you're basically setting yourself up for failure because those guardrails do not also align with the other guardrails that are in part of your life. And so, because of that, we have to make sure that we take into account all sorts of guardrails in the logos, pathos, ethos systems. And when we start to identify through our data driven decision making lens, don't we just love that DDDL? We work through it and helps us making sure that we are adopting what truly makes sense and is part of who we are. Now, we do the same exact thing with our journaling as well. When we're talking about events or decisions that we're working through, or the past events and the things we're wanting to jot down, we need to also leverage the triad, which is understanding when we write down things, evaluating it through each of the three different lenses. First off, is what I'm writing making logical, coherent sense? Is this something that someone else would actually understand from a logical perspective? Is this something that actually resonates with me? Is this something that intuitively makes sense for my emotions? Did I truthfully describe and understand my emotions at the time? Do I understand the somatic signals and did I write those down as well? And then also, when I'm writing with this, how do I feel about it? Did I actually resonate with what occurred? Is this describing who I am? Is this something in distortion and why? And you can jot all that down. So as you're even running the data loop and the resonance test, you can start looking into it and understanding where those differences lie and write them down because that ends up being data. That's not simply something that you are having a gut feeling on. You're recognizing that something is not resonant, and here's why. You're recognizing that these emotions do not embody who you are, and here's why. These narratives are past experiences of this, which I remember this. This experience made me feel this, and here's why. Those are data points, and yes, can be written as part of your journaling experiences. Journaling is meant to be specific to you, is meant to be helpful for you, but you always want to ensure that it is written in such a way that anyone who reads it can understand it and is very objective. Raw data, no slant, just simply describing what happened, your experiences, your observations, and even reflections. Because as you reflect on what happens, you also will start to pose additional questions to yourself that you'll also want to jot down if you feel resonant with it and aligned. This is how it works. Because the more that you incorporate that is from that straight line, data driven lens, you're ensuring that you are recording data that you can use for future reference, especially when the same situations start coming up over and over and over again. And the DII scoring is the exact same way. Because we don't just simply want to give ourselves a score of 1 to 5. That doesn't do anyone any good. If we simply just say that we're a 5, that could be a 5 on every single decision, and that would not be able to improve the DII engine. Because what will happen over time, especially as we start getting into digital tools, if you do decide to go down that route with dashboards and so on, is you'll be able to see from a bird's eye view trends. You'll be able to see where you're misaligned or why your DII scores drop in some areas so that you can make improvements. If you describe your DII scoring, you're in a much better position to do so and ensuring that you are aligned because you're making those decisions and scoring them with raw data. The idea is to score yourself from the same exact logos, pathos, ethos process. Why does this score make sense? I scored myself this way because I feel that this number is right because that's your pathos. I feel aligned with this decision. Here's why. I scored myself low because of this problem with my identity. I misaligned with this part and this part of my identity, and I'm going to do better. I also caution you before we go into the 7-day challenge and the close of this episode to not use the DII score as a criticism. This is the last thing I want you to do. The DII is not meant to be a self-improvement process in terms of negativity. So many of us are ingrained in our lives to get straight A's, 100% on every single test, trying our best. And if we fail, even with just 1 or 2 questions, we failed the entire test. You will never be perfect. Coming from a former perfectionist, you will never be perfect. A's, B's, and C's make degrees. We want to know specifically, do you understand who you are and what you stand for, and what it is that you are doing and why? If you can answer those questions effectively, you have done your homework correctly. That's it. The numbers do not mean anything because if you really think about it, the DII numbers are data too. They're not inherently good or bad, only the meaning or interpretation that you give on them. They're just simply data points. That's it. If we start to use that as a self-scoring mechanism, with our numbers as high, meaning we're better, with numbers as low, meaning we're bad, that is defeating the purpose of the resonance core framework and the DII. The DII is meant to be your engine because it's meant to show you patterns. The score itself doesn't matter. What matters is what was the data that you got from it and why did you score yourself that number? That's it. These are not meant to be self-criticizing or self-serving numbers for your own self-interest. Do not treat them that way. Do not treat anything in the resonance core framework that way, for that matter. I would even argue anything in this world for that matter, but that's just my personal opinion. We criticize ourselves enough. That's not what this is for. Instead, we want to use this as a data-driven means of showing us where we are experiencing distortion, where we are experiencing misalignment, and how we can improve ourselves. Because when we look at it that way, we're actually not even worried about the number itself. All we're doing is just simply evaluating ourselves so that we can transform into who we want to be and ensuring that we're making decisions in who we are and what we stand for. Pretty easy, right? I'll also kind of give you one final thing, just kind of as its own little insight. If you start approaching life this way, life becomes a lot easier because you then realize that the numbers don't mean anything. Little hint for later. Now, what we'll finally do is get into the identity challenge. And basically, the identity challenge this time does have, of course, our prerequisites, which is understanding your identity and ensuring you have your value, virtue, drive system established. But now, the process you'll be using is your daily journaling rituals. Daily journaling needs to be a habit, needs to be an MVD, needs to be a value, virtue system, especially if you're wanting to ensure that you're improving over time. We can say that we are improving all day long because that is a subjective experience. But in order for us to be able to prove it, we need data. We need those experiences of journaling to help us look back and say, why are we actually improving? How can we ensure that we do improve more? And that's what journaling does. So what I want you to do is in the journal, you can make this in pen and paper or in digital means, whatever is easiest for you, to help you do journaling. The goal is to not be overly didactic or have high brevity. Don't write and write and write and write. That serves no one. Only take about 5 to 10 minutes. All you need is just a ritual, a period of time to calm yourself down, reflect back on the previous day's experiences, and then write down whatever comes natural to you. This is exactly what Marcus Aurelius did when he started writing down his meditations. He would do so at night, right before he went to bed, calming the mind, calming the nerves, and just writing whatever came to his mind. Because in that case, it becomes more personable. It's what the brain decides it wants to talk about. It's the subconscious and conscious working together to describe the last day's actions. And once you've done that, you establish the different decisions that you make that you feel are identity aligned, and you score them according to the DII. 1 being misaligned up until 5, which is fully aligned with your drives. And then describe why you scored yourself that way using the logos, pathos, ethos triad. Why did you score yourself this way? What does it mean? How do I feel resonant with this decision? What were my emotional cues and somatics? How is this aligned with my personal identity or not? Or what could I do that I noticed was misaligned so that I can do better the next time? That's it. And over time, when you do these MVDs, you can establish this one as a value virtue system with self-improvement as an example. Over time, that habit just becomes natural. It just becomes something you do right before you go to bed. I usually do it on a personal notebook. I have an iPad right next to my desk right before I go to bed, and I just type on it. It makes it easy. It takes care of it. It's all you have to do. I also put my 8 value virtue drive systems there too, right on the very first page, because that way I can see what they are and I can make changes to them as I start going along. Because you will need to make changes to things and you will start to uncover things about yourself you didn't know. But this will help you being able to gauge and set up that exercise because it will then show you the ways of how you make decisions and you will start to see the patterning of what happens in your life when you make them. Because it will also show you the distortions of your vast unknown. So that way you can be aware of them, ensuring that you make decisions in line with who you are and what you stand for. I will also finally say, because it does require a habit, if it means that you need to break that down so that you're only doing 1 journal entry a week to start, that works. Remember that MVDs and small wins occur with very small win actions. If you start feeling your cues start to fire, if you're noticing your narratives are really starting to fire going back and forth as you journal, slow it down. Remember that you have that tool of the drive loop and the drive alignment loop to bringing down and trimming that MVD down to something that is more manageable. Because we want to make sure that we build this habit, but we also don't want to overwhelm ourselves. Because once we do that, it kills the purpose. And eventually you just start losing the ability and the knowledge that you'll gain from this ritual going forward. So to close before we head out, just remember that the values that we have are the colors in our systems. The virtue system are the tools that lie on our palette. And your drives are how we choose to paint on the canvas, because that's what our identity looks like, is that canvas. But then to add a little bit more to it, those guardrails are the edge of that canvas, which shows us specifically what is possible and what is not. And if we accidentally paint over the canvas outside of the boundary, we drop the tools, potentially putting our values on the floor. The guardrails then act as that. And then the journaling that we do describes what's on the canvas, so that when we start to score ourselves using the DII, our picture becomes more perfect, becomes more aware, becomes more perfected, becomes more resonant. And with that, we'll close the episode. As always, thanks to my listening to the podcast and this episode. I hope it resonated with you, and I hope it gives you more ways just to help you and live a true identity coherent life. Please like, follow, share, or subscribe to the podcast anywhere you get your podcasts, as it helps get the word out and gets it pushed up so more people can access and resonate with it. You can also review information about episodes on our website at theresonantidentity.com, where you will find articles, interactive demos, and all 7-day challenges which you can run over and over again. You can also email us there as well at mail@theresonantidentity.com and access us on social media on Facebook, Instagram, X, Blue Sky, or TikTok. Have fun, be safe, know who you are and what you stand for, and make good choices aligned with your true and chosen identity, aligned with your value virtue system, established by your guardrails, and documented in the legacy arc of your journal. Take care out there.